So, my name is Rich. I'm here to talk about aesthetic gravity in moddable worlds, or MDA for FOCG. But really, it's about idea generation for modding. If you're going to talk about, no, this is who I am. I used to be a metal worker. I used to weld heads onto things. I worked in VFX as a pipeline dev. I then ended up at the BBC, syndicating BBC IP and BBC Games departments. And then for the last 10 years, I've run a small game studio of about 10 people, and we focus on moddable games. So, in order to talk about idea generation for mods, I think you have to talk about why games are moddable and what makes them moddable, and what makes good moddable games. So, we're going to cover deep games versus moddable games. We're going to talk about getting stuck at the mechanic stage of iteration as a developer. We're going to talk about how to anchor or focus on player experience. We're going to talk about what systems are important to open up to modding. We're going to talk about why should this thing that you are modding be composable in the first place. We're going to talk about how to give players compelling tools for discussion of a complex subject, aka modding tools. And we're going to talk about how to reflect on an issue with the appropriate depth. And then from there, we're going to talk about how you take something from just moddable to being composable. So when you're making a game, the kind of most important thing is to have a dialogue with your players. It's not a diatribe. You're not an auteur. You are making a thing for players to feed back on and experience with you. So essentially, when you make a game, you want to be allowing players to tell their own stories back and forth with you. And that's where we move towards modding. It's very easy for indie devs and art game makers to be passionate, but end up kind of getting caught in the trap of being a film director rather than a game developer. But fundamentally, games are creations that you give to players to carve out their own experience. So by the nature of the medium, as soon as the player presses play, the game is not your story, it's theirs. So we have this notion of deep games. So some of the best loved games out there are special because of the time and effort that the developers put into exploring a complex subject matter or system. It's why like strategy and 4X and historical period games are so popular, because there's this sense of craft that I think runs through taking a subject matter and diving into it. So large studios have been getting good at this for a long time, a few decades. But it does largely culminate around historical and military style themes. Traditionally, the process would be define some form of strategy game and its mechanics, find an interesting period in which to set it, then iterate through that, read a heck of a lot of history books, bring in a historian or team of researchers to help ensure accuracy and have them fight to death with your design team, and then build a game around this history and ship it to players. It's very much an end-to-end, like, one-way kind of conversation. Moddable games in the last 15 years or so have basically meant you no longer need to employ a historian. So teams now take a very specific subject and make it into a toy for players to explore. Some of the best games out there are now special because of the time and effort that they've put into allowing the player to explore and tell that story. And what ends up happening is you have experts gravitate towards your game to help you tell it better. So like a great example is how in Kerbal Space Program, the game was not particularly compelling to start with. They then effectively pioneered the ability to download the Unity editor and the original project, and through doing that opened it up to modders who ended up coming and accurately modeling the moonshot gravity pull for slingshotting a space rocket. And that kind of expertise can only really be drawn in by opening your systems up in the right way and in the right order to players. So like this kind of thing now kind of builds into how City Skylines works. Civilization, which is a lauded game for maybe the first few in the series and has some problematic arguments around the last couple, still is an amazing game because of its moddability. And it might not be obvious at first glance, but the most common shared thing between these games is not the size of the team, but it's how much they've opened up depth in their systems for players to mod. So, how do they get there? So there's this thing called game design lenses, and I know I'm going to be talking to you about how to come up with modding ideas, and we're talking about modding systems first, but this is all applicable to being a modder as much as it is to being a game developer or designer. You have game design lenses, you have deep aesthetics, and more importantly, you have curated systems, access, and APIs. So your game is not moddable just because it's open source. And I think this is a pitfall at the moment that we need to work through as a community that is doing a great job of incentivizing open source games and open source development. But that doesn't mean it's naturally moddable, and there's work to be done in order to basically curate that process and experience. So this is what aesthetics are. Many people, I'm sure, have come across the word. I'm not a philosopher. I know some people in the room who are. But fundamentally, like, the reason that aesthetics is important is because it's giving some emotional hook to your player. You know, and that is the thing that you need to latch into with making a game moddable. It's not pure and clever systems. It's actually having something that grabs at the heart of your player and makes them want to change it or adjust it or expand upon it. So these are the kinds of things in the philosophy of aesthetics that you can explore. The sublime part of landscapes, the individuality of human form, the biodiversity and botanical dynamics of natural sciences, right? Like, those are things that I think, although they sound very hoity-toity, you can probably come up with game ideas already in your head that match to some of these things. So why is aesthetics important? It's important because fundamentally, regardless of the definitions here, you come down to the fact that you have an aesthetic object that generates an aesthetic experience, and that is then presupposed upon an aesthetic recipient. That's the process that you need to be thinking about when creating objects within a game that have some meaning to any given player. And then once it has meaning to a player, they're going to look to how to change or engage with it in different ways. So how many autonomous worlds and fully on-chain games currently take their entities and objects seriously as aesthetic items and systems first? How many of them explore truth, goodness, and beauty as core dynamics or aesthetics? And how many of them have got these lenses applied on a regular basis? So it's not an easy one to answer, but effectively there are systems you can apply to your systems in order to think about this in a certain way. So that's what the MDA approach is. Mechanics refer to the specific readable components of the game at the level of data representation. Dynamics describe the runtime behavior that is emergent from those mechanics. And then, more obviously, the aesthetics refer to the desired emotional response. That's your aesthetic recipient, right? It kind of surfaces of this. You've got mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. You have mechanics matching to rules, dynamics matching to systems and how they behave and appear. And then the aesthetics are the fun. They're the end thing, right? So if we're making games, are we making them for players to experience rules? Or are we making them for players to experience systems? Or are we making them for players to experience fun? And it's fun in inverted commas because that's a problematic term. But that is where we want to be, right? So we have to start at this aesthetic side. If we're going to make games that are composable extensions of other games, we need to have methods of making them coherent and compelling to the human psyche. Like, that is aesthetics at its core. And this is a process, and it's an iterative process, right? The dev starts from the mechanics. They hope that some dynamics emerge from their mechanics, and they hope that that has an aesthetic impact on the player. But the player never sees it in that direction. The player sees it from the aesthetics and how they make them feel. They then see how observable those aesthetics and mechanics are in the dynamics that are emergent within the game. And then finally, they think about the mechanics underlying them. And if the dynamics are good, then they can grok what the mechanics might be. And that's part of the thing that players love about learning a game, is going through that process of understanding the aesthetics, diving into the dynamics, and finally really being a master of the game by understanding the mechanics. So it's a loop that you as a developer have to go through continuously. Like, if you are making prototypes and playtesting, you're looking at it from the mechanics side most of the time, and you need to step out every time you do a playtest and see it from the aesthetics end and make adjustments and see how those things are going to play out differently if you tweak them for players in the next playtest. It's like a continuous loop. Here's an aesthetics taxonomy. None of this is fixed. All of this is open to interpretation. But fundamentally, you can see I've put a few of the games that are here up and a few others, and I've tried to match them into various aesthetics. So you have games as sensation, games as narrative and drama, games as challenge, and I've left some of them open so that you can match them up yourself. Yeah, so fundamentally, modding is the focusing of player instincts into your game. And what do I mean by that? When it comes to modding in UGC, players instinctively assess the immersion that they're experiencing. And if they're enjoying it, they decide if it can be a better or more coherent experience. And if they think it can, then they're going to stay playing the game. And they're either going to wait for the devs to do something that takes it further or makes it more engaging or lives up to their fantasy of what the game could be if it was to become a truly great game. Or they're going to dive in and start tweaking components themselves, and that's where they become modders, right? But they have to have some kind of instinctive feeling of the aesthetics driving their sense of immersion and what is going to motivate them to do it. So, to incentivize a community to contribute, we have to provide worlds with identifiable aesthetics, right? And that's fairly straightforward. If you make something that feels visceral in some way, shape, or form, or makes people laugh, then you've got an aesthetic that can be identified. But then you need observable dynamics that interplay with that. So that has to be systems that are simple to see the impacts of the player changing or impacting upon. And then after that, you need granular and transparent mechanics for players to be able to go, oh, I like that dynamic. I think it would be more interesting if this, and then they can work out what data or systems they can adjust in order to change things around and tweak them to their preference. That's the sort of top level of aesthetics. There is an article that I've written on it if you want to go into it in more depth, but we're here to talk about how to generate moddable ideas, so we'll get more into that. So there are key differences between a game world being moddable and it being composable, right? So, and I touched on this at the beginning, moddability is flexible and accessible game rules, semi-open code bases, APIs, high-level language abstraction of gameplay systems, or UI tooling that grants access to many systems or speeds their modification, and extensive documentation. So that's the basis, and you need that before, I believe, a game can be composable. For a game to be composable, it then has to go on to be moddability that aligns with the architecture of other similar games in some way, shape, or form, plus strong and open-ended aesthetics and premises that can be expanded upon or shaped to match with those of others. And then more importantly, permissive licenses to let the audience find new opportunities for the game or world. And it has to have a guided open source code base. You have to spend time making sure that the things that you are opening up to players are telegraphed at the very least. It doesn't mean only parts of it are open, but it means you are directing people to the meaningful systems or meaningful data points. So where to start? How to go about making your game moddable and then composable? I would say ask 4 questions. So can you teach a beginner to mod your game? Like, have you built some kind of tool or interface that makes it easy for someone to interact in some way, shape, or form? And it doesn't have to be a level editor or a tool that you've built in some form of interface. It can just be a streaming assets folder in a binary that is all in open text that can be tweaked, strings that can be changed, variables that can be adjusted. Then the next question is, can an expert in the field that your game is exploring, or the theme or genre, explore it in a depth that keeps them entertained, right? An example is we made a hacking game that we got friends who were from hacker culture or InfoSec practitioners to come and make mods that were funny and interesting to them, you know, and did it keep them engaged? And that included someone putting a cryptocurrency into one. And this was like 2017, I think, at the time. And Muscoin turned out to be Celestia in the end. And that's a true story. So can a group of complete strangers learn to use the tools with your guidance? So can you run workshops where you are helping people through? And that's where we are right now. We are in a place where strangers, with the assistance of mentors, experts, and the users or the developers of the game, can be put together into doing something meaningful in the code base. We ran workshops at hacker conferences and did all kinds of bits and pieces in order to try and generate that kind of sense of guided modding. And once you get that nailed down, can the wider internet learn to use the tools with just your documentation? And this is where it gets really fun and interesting, and one of the things that, like, document early is like the biggest thing. Like, make a couple of the guys that I've spoken to who've presenting games to be hacked on over these days, I've said, like, get a wiki up even if it's empty stubs, because fundamentally your community will be better at documenting than you are. So if you don't have anything there that people can contribute to, you're going to lose information the minute people start modding. So make sure you have some form of documentation, even if it's very, very lackluster. And then, like, when you get those questions answered, you get to the point of, can you incentivize those players to take the game somewhere you don't expect? So we have a game that is moddable, that centers around hacker culture. This is a hacker conference called CCC that happens in and around Berlin every 4 years. And we had a whole load of players who are representatives of different hacker villages build their camping villages as a huge, like, hacker kind of conference site that people could go around and have conversations with various real-life hackers. Like, when Steph went and presented the game, she even had some guys who were unable to bring a laptop, so they loaded Unity and the modding tools onto a Steam Deck. So, you know, new and surprising things is where you want to get to. So what systems are important to open up? And I've crossed out open up because things are open already, right? So what systems are important to curate for modding? So control over narrative is maybe a bit of a misnomer to people because you're thinking about systems all the time. But actually, if you can get some strings in your game that people can write plain English in and change, that is your lowest level barrier to entry that you can tick off. So dialogue systems or events, you can even have people rewriting tutorials where they don't understand them. It's really powerful to do something where it's just string replacement. Control over a core mechanic or the data or stats that drive it. So that's items, weapons, inventory effect. And that's where I think lots of people land. But like, if you can make this fine and granular and give objects that people can change values in and see and impact the dynamics in the world, then you're winning. Control over a core obstacle or puzzle system, much harder. Devices, gates, opponents, these are all things that are integrated throughout many systems in all games. And so they have knock-on effects throughout the wider game. These are hard to get right, and they have cascading effects. But when you give players the right power, it means that they can create, or modders the right power, they can create very different changes to your game that are interesting and emergent and surprising to you as a developer. And then lastly, control over the metagame. So mission scripting, objectives, progression, and branching. This one's harder, but there are examples of games in the room here already who are doing this in interesting ways. Basically, if you can have something from outside the game impact the game in some way, that's where you're kind of hitting that golden nugget and doing something composable that jumps into here. And then take it further, but do it in a scoped fashion, right? So simple character adjustment, and I've sort of tentatively put creation in there. Basic exposed procedural generation elements, seeds and values. Easy localization and community translation. And once you make or curate the files and APIs that are available, the possibility space opens up incredibly. So to wrap this up, effectively, how to apply this to jamming AA worlds. So, like, moddable games are nothing new. Games being open source actually, pardon me, doesn't open up a huge amount to us either, because we've been reversing and deserializing games for decades at this point. And that's effectively an open source game without permission. But games that join to other games, or games that are bridges between games, or games that bridge the worlds and communities inside of them is, I think, unique, and something that by developing open source projects in parallel and giving people permissionless opportunities to mess around with, we maybe do have something interesting occurring. And then finally, like, how do you then apply that to modding something? So, like, pick a game. Do you recognize why this thing should be composable? Or do you have an aesthetic in it that you think is compelling, that you can see matching to something else that you've already made or that someone else is already making? Can you anchor to that aesthetic of the thing you are going to mod? And then can you make the scope tiny and change a single element? So that would be like my recommendation for how you go about trying to pick something while you're here and make it interesting and achievable at the same time. So although I haven't given you like how to generate a mod or an idea for a perfect mod, I've hopefully given you a framework around how to make moddable games, and therefore how to recognize a good game that is moddable, and therefore how to recognize something you can mod into a good game that is moddable. So that is the conclusion there. Thank you very much. Any questions? I will be happy to take them. And otherwise, I would like to grab a couple of people up here to ask a couple of questions around some of these subjects. So does anyone have any questions or things that they want to tell me I'm entirely wrong about, which is totally fine, because these are opinions. Yeah.
So when we do this modding, how do we ensure that the modding is fair for all the players? Because like some players may actually, like, is it always a symmetrical to everyone, or is it like I can mod in such a way that some users use the mods, some users not, and this is like incompatible with each other or giving unfair advantage, something like?
That's a perfect question, and it's something that games that are moddable have battled with for a long time. Generally speaking, the standard that happens in moddable games is if you allow mods into a player's session or saves, then they're not allowed to get Steam achievements, or they're not allowed to engage with other players in certain ways. So you do gate games based on the modding. And that's where this autonomous worlds thesis starts to get kind of a bit mind-bending, right? It's like the idea that if it fits a certain set of rules, then it's just in, and then players have to lump it or leave it, right? And so there's this question of, do you need to have branching or sharding or kind of like games that move in different directions based on mods, or are you making it one big central shared state? My talk doesn't address any of those questions. It's the short answer.
Could you expand upon the parallels between what you just described in answering that and like how tabletop games and house rules kind of blend in with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, depending on the house rules specifically, like a good example is like Madhouse Chess, right? Like a mod on chess is whereby you take a piece, and that taken piece ends up on a double-style partner's board right next to you. I think generally speaking, that same thing applies, which is like you have to have consent from the players playing this game in order for them to feel that the rules are fair or believable in any given way. I mean, you can have players changing rules as they go through a game, right? One of the things that happens in drinking games is you add new rules as people get drunker and miss out on things. And there's a consent that occurs through that process, and that makes it totally fine and fun, and even if everyone gets literally wrecked, it's something that people have consented to. And I think that's another interesting thing that we have to play through in this like autonomous worlds discussion is like, where do the players who are playing this thing consent to having their world changed mid-game or outside of their control? Do they all have to sign up and agree to this set of diegetic boundaries for the world are perfect, and anything that anyone adds is going to be absolutely fine by me, you know? And I don't know, like, that's what's exciting about this space, I would say. Yeah. Cool, all right. So one of the other things I wanted to touch on, because like one of my jobs for coming to the AA Summit was effectively to try and get conventional game developers over here thinking about this stuff. And a lot of the stuff that I've covered doesn't necessarily touch on the vocabulary that they all would use or necessarily feel I'm fully speaking to them with. And so what I wanted to do was get a couple of guys that I know up here that are thinking very deeply about what breaks an on-chain game or what mechanics are or aren't going to work in an on-chain game, and how we deal with things like shared state or secrets or hidden information in this new framework. And I'm going to put some of the people that I know in this space who make conventional games on the spot and get them to ask questions that they might be afraid to ask otherwise. You know, stuff that they might think is a dumb question. Nothing's a dumb question in this space because none of us have any answers yet. So if I can, I'd like to grab Baz and Comet to come up, and we'll just do sort of 5 minutes or until people get tired of me picking on them. So if we grab a couple of chairs. So do any of the cohort of devs from traditional games backgrounds who I've brought along have any burning questions that they would have been maybe shy about asking, but that I've given them total permission to openly ask in front of a room full of strangers? Anyone? Because I'll pick on you otherwise. Okay. Well, in which case, Diogo, what is the biggest question around what a fully on-chain game is or isn't, and how you would design one, or if you could?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for putting me on the spot, Rich. I appreciate it. Yeah, true. I guess my my biggest question, and it's something that I've tried to think about quite a lot and struggle to find like an answer to, and I understand the more that I'm here that no one really has an answer to yet, is I haven't quite grasped what like fully on-chain games can bring to video games that traditional video games cannot do. Because you talked about modding, for example, and that's something that's been done for like decades now. So yeah, it's like other than the technical uniqueness of it, I guess that's my biggest question.
So straight in with the hard stuff. So I'm going to give this to Comet.
A short reintroduction for people that didn't see my presentation earlier. I'm Comet. I promise that I am doing this not as a marketing stunt, but I just go more pseudonymous, at least with recorded presentations. Feel free to approach me throughout the rest of the week. But yeah, I'm going to touch on this question just a little bit because Baz is really the guy you want to hear from. But one of the interesting parts of this is hidden state, right? And let's go back to the example of the Konami code, right? When someone finally discovered the up, down, down, left, right, BA, that was an incredible like epiphany for that person. And they walk through those stages of, oh my gosh, I just found the secret thing. I need to go share it with other people. This is great. Someone built this. Someone else knows that that was built into the game. And one thing that you can do if you design hidden state properly is remove that final stage of someone built this and knew exactly what was going on. What if you took that and said, oh, you know, maybe the developers knew that something could happen, but they didn't know how to do it. They didn't know the up, down, down, left, right, BA was the solution, right? And kind of removing that last stage adds a little bit more intrigue and almost value to that, because then when you go around sharing your friends, like, I discovered this thing first, right? And that has its own player attributed value that I don't know if that's really even possible with traditional games in that same manner. But yeah, I'll hand this off to Baz because I'm sure he has way more insightful answer than what I just gave.
No, I thought it was a great answer. Thank you. I'm Baz. Nice to meet you. I'm Baz. Nice to meet you all. I'm one of the co-founders of Tonk with Goblin Oats, who's hovering around there at the back somewhere. Yeah, he's over there. Tall mustached American man. I think if I've understood your question correctly, which is like, what's so special about the blockchain and why should we be compelled by it as a medium?
Yeah, I mean it's more as well from a player's perspective. Like as a player, what do I look forward to in this genre that I could not get somewhere else? That like in the medium that sort of already exists, like a more traditional form of the medium.
I'm gonna not answer your question, but I'm gonna give you a bunch of stuff which I think you'll prefer. I know the answer to the question, right? I don't think that matters. Like, I've got my very, very strong opinion on why it's better for players and why it's also better for creators. But realistically, what's going on here, if you just take a step back for a moment, is that we're changing like a very deep layer of the stack. We're subbing something out at the bottom for something completely different. And that has a lot of ramifications for the emergent properties that happen on top for a lot of different people. And you can think of this almost as like a big magical bucket of different philosophies and reasons why. And one of the special things about the scene at the moment, thanks to Peter and everyone else who's involved in setting this up, is that we're still somehow bonded together by this commonality that we're onto something important. So for example, if it's like Ruslan and the Mithrium chaps, like this time last year, one of the things they were really pushing was the idea that your game progression is like as secure as Bitcoin, and you might care about that for certain reasons. Cool, great. But there are a whole bunch of other reasons you might be excited about this. You might be excited about why, you might be motivated by the fact that Zynga grew this thing called Farmville on top of this other thing called Facebook, and they kind of interoperated with that social graph, and that was kind of what grew Facebook and what grew Farmville at the same time. And then there becomes this problem, which is that when you're built on a foundation which is not as decentralized as something like email or the domain name system, which is like the OG decentralized technologies of the internet that powered its growth, you get into all these weird legal battles, and Zynga's only recourse is to like leave Facebook after making a whole bunch of money and try and like build their own substrate. And suddenly everyone's got their own substrates, and we belong in an internet where everyone's got their own substrates. And this leads to all sorts of other curious problems as well. Some people get excited about this theme of true ownership. Some people get excited about the themes of like interoperability. Again, I think kind of cool. The thing that really, really motivates me is the fact that the internet today is kind of screwed. And it's screwed for a whole bunch of different reasons. And you see that manifested in like legal cases, and you see that manifested in like me doom scrolling TikTok, and you see it manifested in teenagers having bad like mental health because they're addicted to like horrible content on Instagram and no one's really accountable. And you can give like kind of a meta-analysis of a meta-crisis going on, which is that the power incentives of the internet are kind of screwed up. And games are like the perfect microcosm to analyze that with. I quit my job at Epic when they were suing Apple and Google. Kind of no one really knew why they were suing them, other than that Apple and Google had like way too much power. And it really was as simple as that. Like there are a whole bunch of like legal reasons people found, but essentially the internet, like microcosmed in this case, of like games and game devs and game studios. And someone like David Amor from Playment is probably much better qualified to talk about how this is manifested than I am. In terms of like the pain that creators are going through at the moment when it comes to distribution, when it comes to creation, when it comes to being stuck on this hamster wheel of creation that seems to suck the life out of everything. The reason that's the case is because we kind of live in this feudal web where we're kind of living on the feudal lord's land. And the blockchain is our best hope. The blockchain and other decentralized technologies are our best hope of escaping those power dynamics and creating something which is incredibly neutral and shared for everyone. And again, you see that manifested in like a whole different bunch of reasons in the magical toolbox of reasons. And I think part of our job is to pick those out, one by one and see what works, and take that like leap of faith to make the future happen, because I don't think it will happen otherwise.
And I got like a little bit that actually I can expand on, that is me stealing Goblin's words, which a thing that I learned from like basically doing a jam around what the Tonk guys are building, which is effectively hidden information systems for these games, is that there's a whole load of things that come out of the box that are the inverse of your traditional games design and development process when you're building an on-chain game. And that, like, the first one is shared state. Like, the game is automatically multiplayer, and the game automatically has the door left open if the player before you open the door, right? And that's, like, seems totally normal to people writing smart contracts, but to game developers, it's like, what the fuck? Like, I've got, like, persistent state, like, out the box, and I think that that's an interesting thing that straight away gives you the ability to go, well, how am I going to deal with that as a game designer? How do I make this compelling or interesting? What do I give players that makes this unique? And the same thing goes for hidden information. Like, again, the Tonk guys can elaborate on this in a different way, but if you take that sort of basis on which we've all assumed games can be built, and all of a sudden you can't have hidden state, or the types of hidden state you have to layer in have to be specific things you think about how and why, you're going to design your game in a way that is sort of entirely the opposite to how you would have before, and a bit like when you walk up a road to go somewhere, and then you've come back, and all of a sudden the road looks entirely different because you're looking at the same road from a different perspective. I feel like games designs will evolve in that sort of sense, and so naturally the things that people will play will feel different or have different specific experiences emerge from them. So yeah, this is sort of not meant to sort of steal everyone's time, so I just want to check whether there's any other conventional game designer willing to jump up. Here we go, a very experienced conventional game designer.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you. I'm Amit, the CEO of Proof of Play. We built a game called Pirate Nation, and I was also the lead developer of Farmville. So I lived that quite a bit. And actually, the reason that we got into on-chain games is because Farmville, 300 million players. In 2020, Zynga shut the servers down. That was 1 billion hours of player investment just gone because the game was never upgraded from Flash to mobile. And so for me, the big thing was like, well, how do you actually create something that can live forever? Right? It's not just us that, like, yeah, we as the creators of the game are maybe starting up something, but ultimately I believe it's owned by the community, right? And and so, I think when, as we're developing this, one of the other things that we're trying to discover is game mechanics. So something I don't know if anyone here was early in social gaming or mobile gaming, but like there was a lot of discovery of game. There was like events like this for social games where we were like, how do we use this platform? Like, should we do a gifting mechanic? So one of the things I really hope to get out of my trip here to Lisbon, I live in New York, so it was quite a trip, but like, was to really learn from each other on what are the cool new game design mechanics that we're seeing, and hopefully that leads to cross-pollination and leads to like what are now like the best practices in these other forms of gaming. And so for us, I'll share a couple of those for us. We look at social collaboration and social competition. All of these games are hyper online. They're like yes, there's MMORPGs, but I think this is like even like past that. It's like another level of being like a massively social game. And so for us, the gameplay is not just the thing that happens on the website, but it's also the thing that happens in Discord. It's also the thing that happens on OpenSea. It happens on Twitter. And how do you build game features and game mechanics that live there as well? And that's actually how, when we were thinking about like, Facebook as a substrate, it was like, how does the game extend into the platform? And I think because Ethereum is still evolving, because these blockchains are still evolving, that we're still trying to figure that out, especially as like wallet technology is changing as well. And so really, really cool. It really feels the same as these other platforms. I think there's a lot of legs here, and I'm excited to figure out what the next great mechanics are together. Yeah.
Well, that was the perfect one to finish up on. So, like, thanks very much, and I really appreciate you stepping up and sharing it with us. So the only other thing I would say is, like, to all of you who know this stuff relatively inside out, and I know we've only been around here a couple of years trying to think about this stuff, there are a swathe of people here who this week is their very first exposure to these ideas. And so if you can seek them out and try and find, like, what's the lowest common denominator that you can help explain or draw people in, I think that would be really useful for both sides of the community. So you don't necessarily need to hunt people out, but do what you can to try and find the smallest, simplest way of having some of these conversations with the game devs who are coming to this new. And thanks very much for having everyone here. Yeah.
This is really for the benefit of the game designers in the room who are maybe not the most familiar with how to think, like conceptual models to think about the chain. One of the things that you immediately brush up against is this problem, which is that the thing that makes blockchain so special. I'm so glad you're all here, by the way. Like, it's really, really special that like the scene is growing and morphing into something new and exciting. I think it's awesome, and you're one of us now, if you so choose. And one of the immediate problems you kind of bump up against when creating like novel mechanics is that the thing that makes the blockchain special is its Achilles heel, which is that it's really hard to conceal information, as Comet Shop mentioned. And game designers know, because I can see you all nodding right now, is that we often rely on hidden information so much. And there's a few people in the room that will be able to like uniquely help you with this. So there's some folks who are doing some FHE stuff. Remy just waving over there. There's Leron's around, who's been doing some good stuff on interactive shielding, who did some network states. And myself and Goblin Oats as well will be more than delighted to help you kind of think through the affordances of what's possible with that. So hopefully that can help expand the design space for what's possible this hackathon.
Awesome. Well, let's jam, I guess.